Our next speaker will provide us a perspective from the federal level of government. Dr. Stephen Kennedy is the Deputy Secretary of the Department of Industry, Innovation and Science. Dr. Kennedy received a PhD in economics from ANU. He's a former Deputy Secretary of the Department of Environment, and he was the head of the Secretariat for the Garneau Climate Change Review Update in 2011. He's worked in Treasury and a number of other departments within the federal public service. He is one of the leading lights within the federal public service. He started his career, I understand, as a cadet in the Australian Bureau of Statistics, so he's certainly not afraid of numbers and evidence. He is responsible for the energy and resources elements of the department, and he's going to give us a bit of perspective on the National Energy Productivity Plan and related matters. Please welcome Dr. Stephen Kennedy.
You've outed me as an economist straight away by talking about...
Sorry about that, but they had to know.
I'm sure there's some fellow travellers somewhere in this room. Yes, I saw a couple of nods, that's great. Look, firstly, also just want to acknowledge Jonathan's earlier warm comments, and Department does very much appreciate the way we can collaborate with your team. It's an excellent exercise, and we're very happy to be here supporting this third summer study. It's a great event. And as you remarked, there are some genuine opportunities emerging at the moment and some consensus around issues. But I have to tell you as a policy advisor, it's not all easy going. And one of the things I thought I'd spend a little bit of time talking about today is really the policy rationale that sits behind some of the measures in the National Energy Productivity Plan, in part for those of you who perhaps enthusiastically advocating particular measures, to just sort of get a sense of how these things get argued through government and maybe even help you in your own ways of trying to influence change and get better policy outcomes. I'm going to talk in three parts, just a little on some of the trends in energy productivity in Australia. Not too much on that, just a little to set the scene. Then I'll get into the policy rationale. I promise not to use extensive economist jargon. And then lastly, a bit about the National Energy Productivity Plan. So it's quite a detailed plan. A number of my colleagues are here, and they'll be talking in various sessions across the course of the program. So there'll be you'll get ample opportunity to get into the plan in a bit more detail. As I think Jonathan was outlining, I mean, energy productivity is a straightforward concept from a measurement perspective. It becomes quickly a little more complicated as we get into the policy discussion. But at its simplest, of course, it's a measure of output, usually from our perspectives, usually GDP per some unit of energy. Over the past few years, we've seen a widening in the gap between growth in our economy and in our energy use. In other words, energy productivity has been improving. So there is an underlying, if you like, secular improvement in energy productivity. Much of what's being talked about here today is how to accelerate that. But to just give you a bit of sense of how it's gone over the past few decades, or at least over the past decade, real GDP rose by 32%, while energy consumption rose by 10%. So energy productivity, simply by using the ratio of those two, rose by 20%. And as Steve showed, this is not a trend unique to Australia. This is a trend in other countries. But what we probably can comfortably conclude in Australia, even on those simple metrics, is Australia's level of energy productivity is below other countries, and its also rate of improvement has actually been below other countries, hence the focus on policy. It's also true, and Steve actually showed numbers for how it splits in the US, that some of our improvement in Australia is just simply driven by changes in industrial composition. As we move away from energy-intensive heavy industries towards less intensive industries. And even within industries, there's quite a bit of changes in energy use. To give you an example, in 13-14, energy consumption in mining and transport sectors rose, but it was outweighed by declining energy use in electricity generation, manufacturing and households. So we have I won't go into it in detail, but we have quite a mixed picture underlying that broader trend. Just in terms of the fuel mix, which I think is worth, because I'm going to come back to this at the end, it's worth sort of keeping this in mind, or our sources of energy. That's also changing, becoming somewhat less carbon intensive, but from a global perspective, one would still regard as, on average, a carbon intensive fuel mix. Oil was the largest primary energy source in Australia at 38% in 13-14, followed by coal at 32%, and natural gas at 24%. Renewables accounted for around 6% of Australia's energy mix. The share of coal is actually at its lowest level since the early 1970s, when that series began, but as you saw from that distribution, it still is a very large portion of our primary energy use. Our coal consumption fell by 5% in 13-14, that underpinned by electricity supply, iron and steel sectors. The share of coal in our overall electricity generation mix has also fallen down to 61% from 79% a decade ago, but that's still relatively high globally. But renewable energy, as you all know, is up a lot, and it now accounts for around 15% of electricity generation. And while the share of gas, I think, is levelled in recent times, it had also been growing. I'm going to get into a couple of remarks about the interaction between policy and underlying technological trends, but the primary driver, frankly, of a shift in the shares of energy in Australia, and particularly renewable energy, is policy. In the case of renewable energy, it's the renewable energy target. So this is a kind of a theme, I think, for you to be thinking about across the course of the next 2 days. There are beneficial underlying trends in these things, but what we tend to find is that many of these things are not there unless they're supported by some form of policy. As I said earlier, while it's been the case that our energy productivity has been improving, our level of energy productivity is still less than what it is in other countries. I'll make perhaps a slightly controversial diversion for a moment. This needn't be a concern. If you thought that the distribution of endowments across countries and the industrial structure drove that difference, and you were confident that things were being efficiently delivered in your economy, you may not worry about an international difference, but you've got to be confident about all those other things. And so if you've got to be confident that you're getting efficient outcomes, and if that's not the case, then it may well be that that international comparison is indicating something inefficient or something unproductive inside your economy. And I suspect I've got a room full of people who strongly think that's the case, and I personally think there's more than enough evidence to suggest that's the case. Once you start thinking that way, then you quickly move away from just simply that simple international comparison, and then you start to focus on, well, what are the barriers that are driving us to have less efficient outcomes than we otherwise would? And this is sort of how we organise our thinking when we think about the sort of national energy productivity plan. We really, it's not about fear, it's about trying to think, well, what are the barriers that are preventing us from getting more efficient or more productive outcomes? So the Minister Speakman, spoke about a couple of these before, but they can be something like people placing a low priority on energy use, particularly when energy costs, as you know, for businesses can be important, but small relative to other costs, such as labour costs. And they can perhaps feel there's little incentive for them to invest in energy productivity improvements. So we've got to think about, and that's what we try and do as we set up our policies, how to address that particular issue. The other chronic issue is one around the lack of information. A lack of information on energy-saving technologies, asymmetric information, which is just a complicated way of saying the two players who are trying to negotiate outcomes, one knows more than the other, and in a sense they might exploit that. And frankly, information can be poorly understood because it's highly technical. Businesses often lack advice and the support they need to improve energy productivity, and they may, as I said, may not appreciate the benefits of doing so. And consumers continue to lack easy access to their own energy data. So even in making their own decisions, it's hard for them to calculate the savings of energy productivity improvements. As you know, there are a number of ways in which that's currently being addressed, but one would have to say in Australia that the lack of access to appropriate information remains a barrier to people making better decisions, both businesses and consumers. Split incentives was mentioned earlier, so I won't go into that, but that's particularly where owners and occupiers have differing views or neither capture fully the long-term benefits of change. So these are long acknowledged barriers, but they don't go away, they persist. And what I find when I'm going through these types of policy processes, that it's really useful to continue to go back to these fundamental barriers, redress them and see how the current suite of policies is addressing them. The last one is price distortions, where prices are not reflecting the true cost of use. And I think networks, which was raised earlier, is a classic case where just smearing costs or not effectively pricing network costs can lead to a very inefficient use of electricity. The last one is financing barriers. And we've certainly seen organisations like the CFC be very effective in getting in and addressing financing barriers, just because often one can find in financing activities a lack of experience in financing, particularly a new and novel activity, sees mainstream financiers slow to lend into a new activity, and activities like the CFC can address that. So that's just a quick skip through a pretty standard. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. As I said, I still find it a very useful kind of rubric of thinking through where I'm acting on what's driving the design of our National Energy Productivity Plan. But I'm going to argue that the most compelling argument for improving energy productivity in Australia is the role it plays in lowering Australia's emissions and helping the government to meet its emissions reduction targets. So certainly, I think I've heard also this morning that people talk about the complementary role, but I would argue that its primary and crucial role is as part of a suite of policies is in meeting those targets, and it's the predominant, or if you like, the most significant failure or challenge. I think this is even more compelling when you consider a recent Journal of Economic Perspectives article, which I'm sure you've all read, but which I recommend, which is called "Will We Ever Stop Using Fossil Fuels?" And it's a really interesting article which basically finds that absent of policy change, there's no reason to expect fossil fuel consumption to decline. In other words, there's no reason to expect renewable or other forms of energy to beat fossil fuel technological change. The capacity to discover new reserves, the capacity to extract them more cheaply. In other words, in terms of, in terms of addressing the climate change challenge and reducing emissions, we will clearly need policy that actively addresses that issue, rather than simply relying on underlying secular trends in technology and people's interest. Lastly, just from an international perspective, the International Energy Agency, which has been mentioned a couple of times, estimates that half of the emissions reductions required for a 2 degrees pathway could come from energy efficiency and fuel and technology switching in end users. In other words, demonstrating the overall importance of an energy productivity plan in meeting those targets, and hence it's one of the key parts of the Australian government's plan to reduce emissions for its 2020 and 2030 targets. Just briefly, a couple of things on the plan. I don't want to hold up you getting to see the new Chief Scientist. So no doubt going to talk about some very exciting technologies. But the National Energy Productivity Plan, as I mentioned, was released late last year. It's a good starting point. It's a good framework and work plan. And its target, of course, is to deliver a 40% improvement in Australia's energy productivity by 2030. But just as the climate change targets are targets which are going to require review in 5-year cycles, as was agreed in Paris, so we're going to have to revisit our targets around energy productivity if they're a key component of meeting those targets. Very briefly, in summary, the plan's constructed probably around 2 main themes: more productive consumer choices, which make their choices easier, and helping businesses compete and providing them with more incentives and an opportunity to make better choices, and more productive energy services through measures which support innovation, competitive modern markets and consumer protection. I won't go through some of those measures. As I said, a number of them are around pricing reforms, network tariff reforms, which is another way of saying pricing energy more efficiently, or particularly in that case electricity, and decision tools, comparison websites. Because as I said, my colleagues will be talking about them as we go across the day. I will just mention, since you're probably interested and since it was raised, The emission standards for vehicles is part of the National Energy Productivity Plan. That's a group, for those of you who are interested in engaging in that, that's led by Ministers Hunt, Frydenberg and Fletcher. And they're setting up issues papers in the process for the effectively the regulatory process that we would go through to look at establishing emission standards for vehicles. I'm sure some of you, but perhaps not all of you, know whenever we're trying to do these standards, we pass through things called regulatory impact statements, a sometimes torturous but always rewarding process where we have to where we have to demonstrate the net benefits of these regulatory approaches, and of course they'll naturally go through that process. So, as I said, can I just finish by saying thank you very much for your engagement, Jonathan and the team. We're very happy to be part of this, and I hope my team gets a lot out of the engagement they're going to have over the next couple of days. As I said, I think the National Energy Productivity Plan is a very important step forward, but it is only one part of the Commonwealth's policy toolkit to reduce Australia's emissions, but it is a very important contribution. And in summary, there's little doubt that the integration of climate and energy policy sits at the centre of all domestic and global solutions to the challenge of climate change. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak to you.